Joining us now, our friend from Nantucket, Massachusetts, in Sports Illustrated. Look at you, Albert Breer. SPF,
like
buddy.
Wow.
Do you know? I know you're SI, but do you know SPF too, Albert?
Not familiar with it.
Good
Not
Lord.
familiar. It's all natural. Yeah.
I thought Jack Golke was tan last night playing for the Thunder. But
Well, Rich knows this is like my greatest quality is my ability to tan. It's kind of sad, but here we are.
Jeez.
So, I don't mind flaunting it when I have it.
Good to see you, Albert. Thanks for taking time out of some of your remaining downtime between now and March to join us right here. What are you picking up from the Giants' Hard Knocks? I started the show by essentially thanking the Giants for letting us in on all this stuff, because I know the way this Hard Knock stuff works with the NFL Films Group and how terrific they are, and how there's kind of a get together on what we see and what there isn't. There just appears to be a ton of nuggets from the first couple of episodes. What have you picked up on, Albert?
I know the Giants were nervous. A couple of weeks ago, I talked to a few people there. I did a story. Joe Shane was involved in that story on whether or not we're reaching an all-access tipping point, with NFL content. And this doesn't just relate to this. It relates to obviously the Roku channel draft series, which you guys are really familiar with.
Oh, yeah.
And, I think it's like more, it's just, there's a level of sensitivity with off-season content that I think has made teams uncomfortable with this. And I think it's going to require a little bit more work because they've gotten to such a comfort zone with the training camp stuff and even the in-season stuff. And it was interesting because, Joe had brought up this point to me that I thought was fascinating, which was he was there in Miami. I think it was 2012 when they did Hard Knocks during training camp. And he said, like, for better or worse, like we knew every week that like whatever was out there was out there. And so, I think it's Tuesday nights, right, that they air. Every Tuesday night we could turn on the TV and what had happened that week was in there, was done. And it was pretty much self-contained because it just involved us. It didn't involve players who weren't on our team or other teams. It just involved us. So it was while the cameras are some places you might not be comfortable with, it was pretty self-contained. This is completely different, and this is while the idea of putting cameras everywhere and miking everything has been done by NFL Films for a long, long time. This is totally different, because in these cases, to give a real view into what's happening, you have to involve other teams, right? Like the trade talks, like our free agents, where are they going? What other teams are involved with this free agent? All of that different stuff is involved. And, I think the Saquon example is a good example too, where there's this player that you've had a really great relationship with and you've been through a lot with, and now you're, legitimately witnessing a breakup. Like, all due respect to guys who are cut at the end of camp, that's generally not what that is. At the end of camp, it's tough to cut guys, of course. It's a really hard part of any of these guys' jobs. But that's a guy like you might have only had around for 3 or 4 months, right? Like with Saquon, it's a guy they've had a relationship with since 2018 in the organization, So I think it's trickier to navigate. Obviously, the league wants to create more and more of this content. It's going to where the audience is, right? And a lot of younger people consume content this way. So the league wants to meet the audience where the audience is. And, I think we've gotten more and more sensitive stuff, which I think has brought us closer to a tipping point where it just requires more work, I think, now to make sure that these things work for everybody involved. And you don't leave a sour taste in teams' mouth where other teams are watching this Giants series and saying, no way, Jose, are we ever doing anything like that.
So your answer to me asking for what you've picked up on it being that the Giants were really nervous about it and a lot of teams are now really sensitive about it means something sensitive has been picked up by you. What are they? What have you gleaned from this?
Yeah, there are a couple like that were really interesting when I was doing the work on this story, which everybody can go read at Sports Illustrated. It's a couple weeks ago. I'll tweet it after we get off the air.
Thank you, sir.
It was there were a couple that I thought were really interesting. Like one, like a little subtle one, right? Was like I had heard before the draft that the Rams were looking at trading up for one of two guys, right? One was Brock Bowers, that was first, and the second was Byron Murphy. The Byron Murphy thing, they were very sensitive about that, and that never saw the light of day until the draft series came out, right? Now, you might say, what's the difference between trading up for Bowers or trading up for Murphy? Well, In the Rams case, it was, well, then Jared Verse is going to see that, and he's a pass rusher just like Byron Murphy is, and Braden Fisk is going to see that, and he's a three technique just like Byron Murphy is. So how does it make those guys feel, right? Like to see that. Another one that was sort of interesting was the Howie Roseman one, right? You're familiar with that, with the Adam Peters Howie Roseman thing from the Roku series?
Go for it.
Right.
You're talking about the pick is in, which you can see
Right,
here as well.
Like Howie, Howie, you're a pain in the ass. That comment, right? Like, and like they're talking about Howie being a pain in the ass. I mean, I can tell you for a fact the Commanders actually went to Howie himself and asked him for permission to put that in. So the Commanders actually had to do some back work and saying like, hey, like we need to make sure this other team's okay with this, right? Because the Eagles didn't sign up to be part of the series, so that kind of created some stuff where they went to, I know Adam Peters went to went to Howie Roseman, and went to Bob Lang, who's the PR guy there in Philadelphia, who Peters had been with in San Francisco, to make sure that it was okay that they put that in. That's what I'm talking about. Like,
so this is now confirming, Howie Roseman confirming that he is in fact a pain in the ass, is what you're saying.
Yeah. Or at least okay with being called one. Is that all right?
Well, I don't think he is. I mean, by the way, he's working in the right town for saying, please let everybody know I'm a pain in the ass. I mean,
a compliment though, isn't it? Like,
I think so.
Like I'm being a pain. I'm being a pain in the ass trying to get the best deal possible for my team. That's a compliment for a GM, right?
Right.
But they want to check, and I think a big part of this is like one of the big no-nos of Hard Knocks over the years. And I talked to our mutual friend Mike Mayock about this a few weeks ago when the Raiders series came out. It's like, you don't put other people's business out there. That was a big no-no for him. And I think that that's what it was for the Commanders in this case, right? Like we signed up to be part of this, but the Eagles didn't. And as part of this, now the Eagles business might be getting put out there. So we better go check with them, even though they're a division rival and everything else, like professional courtesy, make sure like they're okay with this, or we're going to put our foot down on it. Right. And so like, that's an example of how that's more complicated. Like that stuff might be happening in training camp, like trade talks and stuff like that, but we haven't really seen a whole lot of it. You know what I mean? Like a lot of that stuff hasn't really seen the light of day in the Hard Knocks series, but it's so central to the off season, right? Like if you're going to do an off season series on the draft, on free agency, on whatever it is, like that has to be included. You can't have a legitimate series without it. So that's what I mean when I say that makes it more complicated, because you're putting out the business of people, you're putting out other people's business when those other people didn't sign up to be part of it in the first place the way that you did.
Yeah, I hear you. And, again, I remember that Raiders Hard Knocks series because you could say that the episode after the helmet affair and the foot affair and the
Canada. Remember it was Canada.
All of that with Antonio Brown was truly the most anticipated episode of Hard Knocks, and hardly anything was in it. And I think, Mayock kind of, along with the rest of the Raiders, are like, screw it. We're not putting out that business. Too bad. And that really did damage to the series, which, again, is not the Raiders or Mayock's concern. And I think this is what you're touching on right here, Albert.
Now, think about this, though, Rich. I hate to cut you off.
Remember
what they were coming off of, though? You remember the Hard Knocks the year before?
Which was, what was that again?
Cleveland.
Right.
Where we taught everything. Right? Like, so
we did. Yeah, I know. And that's the whole point of it. Now that if we're including the offseason, at what point does content get in the way of teams doing their business and being honest with one another in meeting rooms where honesty is crucial, and honest with other teams, calling one general manager pain in the ass, or conducting their business with another team like, hey, why would I trade with a team if this is going to be recorded and thrown out there? Do we need to have non-disclosure forms signed with each other before they have trade talks? And again, that may sound crazy, but this is the sensitivity clearly. If the Rams are sitting here thinking we may now have a problem with the kid that we drafted if he's seen that the first choice we had was somebody else, even though that's the way that business is done. So I don't know what the answer to it is, but all I know is I am Fascinated by these conversations that I'm seeing in these rooms with Joe Schoen and the rest of his staff. Fascinated by listening in on the conversations of Joe Schoen with Saquon Barkley's agent and Saquon. Fascinated when John Mara walks in the office of Joe Schoen to have a conversation about where's Saquon going. I'm even fascinated by the conversations, the chit-chat that Brian Daboll's having with these prospects. I mean, putting these guys on the board. We saw Drake May on the board. We saw Jaden Daniels on the board. This is
right.
This is awesome. Like I
Drake
love
May
it.
was the guy they were trying to trade up for, so we saw why, right? Like, you know what I mean? Like you see why they were looking to move up, and they were talking to New England about going up to 3, right? Like it's because Drake May blew them away. It's a fascinating conversation, Rich, and I can actually speak to this because I work a lot on stories like that, that dig into how Aaron Rodgers wound up in New York, how Caleb Williams became a Bear. And I fight for those details, right? Like that's a big part of what I do. And, like through the relationships I've been able to build over, so many years covering the league, like I've kind of come to a point where I've been able to negotiate some of that stuff. And I can tell you it's not easy. I would say the biggest thing, if the NFL asked me, I would say you have to treat these teams like partners. And that's what, Mike Mayock invoked the name of Steve Sabol. Steve Sabol had so much respect within the ranks of team people, coaches, scouts, players, everybody, that they knew Steve Sabol was going to take care of them. And so that allowed a lot of these projects to sing, because it was like, yeah, we know at the end of the day there's going to be a good project, and we know Steve Sabol is going to take care of us. I don't know that there's that singular person now that the league employs at Films that has that relationship with every single team. And I think that is such an important thing. So I think it's an ability to work with people as partners, right? And it's like, we're not sitting here nervous the night before the show. We're not fighting against each other for stuff. We're working together as partners. Like that to me was like the genius of NFL Films. Was they weren't operating as a journalistic outfit. They were working as a partner of the teams. And that was what Steve Sabol did so well. And, obviously the more you ask for from teams, the more those partnerships are going to be really, really important and are vital now with, all of these different, sort of faucets the NFL is trying to turn on to create content.
Albert Breer here from Sports Illustrated. A few minutes left with him on the Rich Eisen Show. We had Justin Jefferson on this program just yesterday. Asked him if he was surprised about Kirk Cousins leaving. He said yes and no, and how the no was sort of he expanded on the business relationship that obviously Kirk and the Vikings were going through in relation to knowing that Jefferson had to be signed, and the yes he didn't really expand on, which is like, I'm Justin Jefferson. Why would you leave me if you're a quarterback? So that now leaves the question of Sam Darnold and J.J. McCarthy. What's your best guess on how the Vikings ship navigates those waters this fall, Albert?
I think they think higher of Sam Darnold than a lot of people do. And I think, all due respect to your Jets fandom, I do think that I think the Vikings feel like he is a distressed asset and a guy who wasn't properly raised in the league and dealt with a lot of rocky waters. And I guess there's almost like a Geno Smith quality to it too, where it's like, man, like this guy's had a chance now to take a minute and learn from his mistakes. And I think I would implore anybody who's listening to this to go back and watch the fourth quarter of the Niners-Ravens Christmas night game, because that game was a blowout. Right? The Ravens won going away. But I remember watching the end of that game, and Sam Darnold played about the last 10 minutes. And seeing him in the context of having those players around him and those coaches around him and playing for Kyle Shanahan, I remember thinking to myself, this guy's playing faster. Like, this looks like a different player. And I've talked to Kevin O'Connell about that, and he said they saw the same thing. And Sam had a really strong spring. So what does that do to J.J. McCarthy? I think it enables them to be patient when they need to be patient with J.J. McCarthy. And I know Kevin's been very detailed about putting together a tiered, you have to hit these markers before we're going to put you on the field. And a lot of coaches say that, you know what I mean, with first-round quarterbacks, but they don't really do it. And it can be to the detriment of a quarterback that they get pushed out there because it's like, well, what the hell, just play him, I think the better Sam plays, the better situation becomes for JJ McCarthy, within reason, where if they think they can win with Sam Darnold, and I believe right now they think they can win with Sam Darnold, and Sam Darnold's going to get the first snap in training camp, that's going to enable Kevin to enact like the entire plan that he has for JJ McCarthy, where JJ is going to have to hit these detailed markers along the way before they think about putting him out on the field. I'm not saying this is Aaron Rodgers, Jordan Love. Obviously, that's different. But I do think that like the way Sam Darnold looked at the end of last year, and then the way he's looked in the spring has at least created some flexibility for the Vikings and how they handle JJ McCarthy, which again, I think long-term winds up being a best of both worlds situation.
Yeah, it's Baker Mayfield is the analogy that I keep landing on here. And it's not apples to apples, because you could say also Alex Smith, right? Which would mean JJ McCarthy's in the Mahomes position, and that's a very unfair comparison to make. But Baker was drafted 2 spots ahead of Sam. Baker did win a playoff game, did make a playoffs that Sam has not had. Baker did have a cup of coffee in the NFC West before winding up in his new spot that I think a lot of people thought really gave him the fuel to rise in Tampa last year. Maybe that cup of coffee in San Francisco for Darnold is the same situation in Minnesota, which has the weaponry similar to, one would say, Tampa had, ready for Baker. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. And it's kind of right there. Canales helping out Baker. Kevin O'Connell might be the right sauce for Sam after he had his Shanahan time, after Baker had his McVay time. I don't know. Like that's the analogy I keep landing on here for this.
I mean, and like how many of these guys I remember having this conversation with a Seahawks coach, to go back to Geno, when we were walking off the field at training camp, and this guy I've known for a while, and he said to me, he's like, being around Geno makes me wonder how many more guys there are like this, like that have talent, that were just mismanaged when they were young, that went through coaching changes, that had to switch teams, that had everything turned upside down, and then they got some time to sit and wait. And then they got in the right situation, and all of a sudden it was like, like the reason he was drafted so high in the first place was legitimate. It was just he wasn't in the right situation. There are very few young quarterbacks that I believe can overcome bad circumstances. And, we can talk about Mahomes all we want. He had a great circumstance. We can talk about Lamar, like Josh Allen. Those guys walked into awesome situations, right? Like those guys were all in great situations. How many quarterbacks have legitimately been able to overcome bad situations as young players? You can't find them. Now, that doesn't mean Mahomes wouldn't have done it. That doesn't mean that Lamar wouldn't have done it or Josh wouldn't have done it. They weren't asked to do it, right? Like they walked into really great situations that helped them grow. And, Andrew Luck is the only one I can look at and say, yeah, that guy had a shaky situation and he still wound up being a playoff quarterback early in his career. It's just so rare. That like 100%, like I think you could look at somebody like Sam and say, here's a kid who's pretty smart, who came out, who was more raw as a player than people wanted to admit, who probably went to the wrong system, went and played in like a Peyton Manning system, which was not quite right for him. And I remember hearing people back then, like this guy would be good for a Shanahan system. Then he gets in one and all of a sudden he looks really good, right? I think you can put the pieces together and see where this could be a very real new beginning for Sam Darnold, whether that means he's in Minnesota for a few years or, maybe like you said, you bring up the Alex Smith, Patrick Mahomes situation. Like maybe this becomes a great problem to have where both guys have a great year, Sam Darnold on the field, JJ McCarthy in the background, and Sam winds up somewhere else in 2025 as a starter, and JJ's ready to go, having a full year of learning under his belt into next year as well.
Before I let you go, Albert, onto your Nantucket Wednesday, where you're having George Kittle come out here shortly, and I will put him in the position of talking about another team, another player on his team's contract situation. What do you think is happening with Aiyuk, if anything, and how it plays out with Brandon Aiyuk?
I would just remind people that things were a lot uglier with Deebo Samuel. You don't remember this, but 2 years ago, things were much uglier with Deebo. If you remember, the argument at the time was he doesn't want to play running back. I would point out that in the 2 years since signing his new deal, he has averaged more carries than he did the year before signing the deal. So, like, for all that stuff, and you remember that noise, right, Rich?
Oh, yes.
Where it was like how ugly that got. I don't want to do this anymore. And now he's carried the ball more since than he did that year. So I think this is a solvable issue because I know what the Niners' intention is, and the Niners' intention is to sign Brandon Aiyuk long term. And they've been down this road before. They obviously went down it with Nick Bosa last year, Debo 2 years ago. They've found a way to get these things done. And the fact that as our buddy Mike Silver reported a couple of weeks ago, they've made offers that are over $25 million per year, tells me they're willing to go the extra mile. Now, does that mean that it's not complicated? That Justin Jefferson got 35 and CeeDee Lamb's still out there, and man, does Brandon want to wait for CeeDee Lamb's situation to clear up? So maybe the market moves more. And of course, all of that, you can't say that doesn't complicate it. Of course it complicates it. But I do think the Niners believe their number one receiver right now is not Debo Samuel. It's Brandon Aiyuk. And so, I think the guy that if they had their druthers, they would keep between those two would be Brandon Aiyuk. I think you can see that intentionality and the money they put in front of him. And I think ultimately, they will wind up getting something done with Aiyuk.
All right, man. Send me a picture of a juice bar ice cream cone. I need that.
I will. I'll do that tonight.
It'll get us. Do that tonight. Do that and send it to us. Send it to me. Send it all around. We'll send it out there. And again, Albert, aloe vera SPF. Come on now.
Yeah. Well, the juice bar might have. I might be carrying a little extra weight with this tan too. Hopefully, it hides it.
Do it. It's one of the best ice cream in America.
Great, more pastels. Let's go.
Take care of yourself, Albert. We'll see you soon.
All right. Thanks, guys.
The great Albert Breer from Sports Illustrated. He's going to also tweet out that article he wrote about Hard Knocks, this current series, and we'll amplify that as well. Catch the Rich Eisen Show every single day on the Roku channel, 12 to 3 Eastern, for free.